Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our Daily Penguin, my tour through pretty much every penguin that I've ever read, which is pretty much every penguin that's ever been. We're doing the Black Spine Penguin Classics, and today we are talking about a slim thing, something that will take you an hour to read, but it has been the source of endless conversation, endless debate, endless analysis. It's Utopia by Thomas More, which he wrote in 1515 and published in 1516. And this Penguin translation is by Paul Turner from, I think, the 1960s. Yeah, 1965. Paul Turner does a translation of Utopia itself, which is just a slim thing. A translation of some of the prefatory material, letter that an explanatory letter, a contextualizing letter that Moore wrote to his friend Peter Gillis of Antwerp. Little bits and pieces here and there, and a lot of critical notes in the back. And an introduction where Paul Turner not only describes to the best of his ability some of those contentions around Moore's Utopia, but also explains his own ethos as a translator. In the course of our looking at Penguin Classics, we're going to be dealing with both of the elements that have been plaguing us from the beginning, not only the vagaries of time, where happenstance could mean that we have one manuscript of a book to work with, but also the niceties of translation and how you deal with that. What school of translation, where on the spectrum of translation do you fall? More accurate and less accessible? More accessible and less accurate? Where on that spectrum are you going to fall? Turner, in his introduction to this book, wittily remarks on people that responded to him when he told them that he was working on a new translation of Utopia by saying, "Translate? What do you mean?" Because they assumed it was in English. And that's because this is so well familiar to people, the concept, if not the book. Most people who talk about utopian this or dystopian that have never read Moore's Utopia, which is... It's very interesting. I would argue that I have many things to argue about this book, but I would argue that it is proto-science fiction, especially in the sense that it's world building, and that the world building is supposed to be convincing. It's the story of a world, a place, a country called Utopia, that Thomas More, who is a character in this book, and Peter Gillis and a whole bunch of other people are talking about. Because a traveler from an antique land, Raphael Hithlogeus, has been there and back. And Raphael has stories to tell about Utopia and what it's like and how the things that people do there. And it allows More, who was a lawyer at the time that he wrote this, but had not even begun his ascent to the heights of the Tudor power structure. That had not even started. It allows More to speculate on what an ideal society would be like. What is life like in Utopia? It's going to be impossible for a 21st century reader to avoid noticing that it's largely communist. The means of aggregating massive amounts of disproportionate wealth aren't even there. But in addition to that, the populace has been conditioned against it. Having wealth or ornament of wealth is passé. It's something you grow out of. Children play with valuable gems in Utopia, but grow out of it. They're not interested in those things once they get older. People have as much or as little as they need. Chamber pots are made of gold, specifically to condition people to dislike gold by disliking what is made of gold. But the communist part, the living in communal, in communal well-being with each other, that's one thing. And the state-sponsored euthanasia is another thing. It's all very thought-provoking. It's all designed to start arguments. But the debate over this book has largely arisen, I think, over the fact that so much of what's happening in Utopia that seems to be presented by Raphael with approval is absolutely antithetical to Thomas More. There's all sorts of different religions in Utopia. There's all sorts of religious tolerance in Utopia. Thomas More oversaw the torture of heretics, and if you believe Hilary Mantel, he did so gleefully. Certainly, certainly a lot of the dictates, a lot of the ideals in Utopia do not reflect the Catholicism of Thomas More, who was not only a prominent Catholic, but is a Catholic priest, or a Catholic saint now. So you go through the book, you read the book in little time at all. If you read the book not knowing anything about its author, or the sarcastic, extremely perceptive intellectual circles that he ran in. I mean, Peter Gillis was a sweet-hearted mouse of a man, but it's entirely possible that Raphael was patterned on an Erasmus, who was More's friend and fellow co-translator of classical models for this sort of thing, Lucian in particular. If you read this book through and you don't know anything about Thomas More, you're going to come to a fairly concrete character of what the author is like. And then when you're introduced to the actual author, your head will spin, because you'll think, how could this man have written this book? How could he be approving of these things? So many of these things. And the answer to that question is based on whether or not you think this book approves of what's going on in Utopia. There's a very, very famous critic of this book, I don't even know, 80 years ago, who said that it's not, that the institutions that we're seeing in Utopia, all the different ways that people live, are not held up as admirable things. They're held up as in mockery, in sarcasm of the ultimate exponent of the horrible way that things are going now. If the church does not intervene, if people are not morally saved, this is how it could all end up. It's amazing to me how many people bought into some variation of that reading, when in order to buy into that, you have to believe that nothing that you're seeing or hearing or reading in this book about Utopia is said with genuine approval. I find that very hard to believe. I've never been able to do that in this book. Quite a bit of the features of Utopia are presented with approval. Like, for instance, I'll read you a little bit here to give you a flavor of Turner's translation. At one point, he's talking about, in Book 2, there's a big difference between Book 1 and Book 2, but still. In Book 2, at one point, the narrator is talking about things that are not of value. And mentions at one point, in the category of illusory pleasure addicts, they include the kind of person I mentioned before, who thinks himself better than other people because he's better dressed than they are. Actually, he's just as wrong about his clothes as he is about himself. From a practical point of view, why is it better to be dressed in fine woolen thread than in coarse? But he's got it into his head that fine thread is naturally superior and that wearing it somehow increases his own value. So he feels entitled to far more respect than he's ever dared to hope for if he were less expensively dressed, and is more indignant when he fails to get it. That hinges around the fact that in Utopia everyone dresses the same. Everyone dresses in just ordinary plain clothing. But you can see that, first of all, the tone that Turner's going for there, very direct, very conversational. The previous absolute ubiquitous translation of this book was pretty creaky. It was due for an overhaul, and the nice thing about Penguin Classics is they constitute the overhaul. They're not just any translation. They get into schools. They get more widely distributed. They're in every bookstore and presented as just an ordinary book that an ordinary person can pick up, part of the Penguin mission. So if you do a Penguin Classic of something, your translation is probably going to get a lot more currency than anybody else's. And the older translation of Utopia needed to be replaced. But that's the question that you're going to be grappling with when you read this little book, is what did Thomas More mean by this? What is he getting at? Now, that was never an easy question to answer, even for his nearest and dearest, even for his family, even for his friend Erasmus. That was never an easy question to get at, what Thomas More meant about anything. What did he really think or believe about anything? But in this book, it's quintified. This is the quintessence of that question about Thomas More. What did he mean about Utopia? Is it something we're supposed to aspire to, or is it something that is supposed to be a cautionary tale for the church to get off its duff and start reforming people's hearts? And regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, where you decide how there have been term papers, endless term papers written about this, either way or other ways. The one avenue of interpreting this book that I almost never see is, I think, when you read it, especially when you read it in the Latin, unavoidable. I find it unavoidable, which is that it's neither of those things because this is a trifle. Because this is a trifle. I mean, it's Thomas More's Utopia, and that is entered into common parlance. Everyone knows the word Utopia, even if they don't know where it came from. I've never read the book. Nevertheless, that can happen even with trifles. This is, I mean, jingles in commercials can enter into the zeitgeist, so of course books can. I don't think a whole lot of much of anything went into this book. It's a little contrary. It reads very much like a young man's book, but it's a little contrary here, a little contrary there. It would certainly not have been approved of by any Tudor monarch, especially the monarch who would go on to kill Thomas More. None of it would have been approved by that monarch, especially the more that monarch drifted into autocracy, drifted into insanity. But the More who wrote this wasn't thinking about that. He was just flinging crap all around, exactly like his friend Erasmus did in The Praise of Folly, exactly like a bunch of other people were doing. I've always been a little mystified why people want to build entire castles of interpretation on what seems to me to be a silly bit of nonsense. A fun bit of nonsense. World building like this always is. Philosophers from time immemorial have tried to envision what their perfect society would be like. This falls in line with that tradition. I always feel a little bit of foreboding when someone tells me that this falls into line with that tradition, because a lot of the exponents of that tradition, Plato, of course, are very serious. And I don't believe this is a very serious book. But you might think different. Anyway, I strongly recommend The Turn of Translation. It is he updates a lot of the names. He tries his best to preserve a lot of the punning. There's endless punning in More's original. He tries to preserve a lot of that, and if you're going to do that, the only way you're going to do that is with contemporary language. And this came out, 60 years ago. So the contemporary language has changed. So you run into problems. It was his decision as a translator, and I respect it. I think it works more than it doesn't, even now. But that is our penguin for today, Thomas More's Utopia. So I'll wrap this up, and we will move on next time. Thank you, BookTube.